Good evening. Welcome. Welcome to Project Impact Forum with Ian Urbina and Dr. Lee Raymond about drilling down, a New York Times series on fracking. Before we start, we have a couple of things to do. First of all, my name is Elizabeth Dorrance Hall. I'm a PhD student in the Brian Lamb School of Communication, and I am the graduate assistant for Project Impact, the group that put on this forum today. So I want to tell you a little bit about Project Impact. This is the first of our 4 forums we'll be holding this spring, and we'll get you more information about the rest of our forums as you exit this evening. But we've produced dozens of these forums before. They're all interactive, and it provides a really great experiential learning experience for our students that are involved in Project Impact. I feel very, very blessed to be able to work with these students. They're the best and the brightest on Purdue's campus, and to be able to work with Ambassador Carolyn Curiel, our director and founder of Project Impact. So our students come from all corners of campus. They have many different majors and many different interests, and Project Impact is able to serve them all. Our students get to work with people who are at the top of their professions from all over the country. These are journalists, politicians, industry analysts, and media executives. We've also had the honor of teaming up with Discovery Park Center for the Environment and the Energy Center, as well as the Global Sustainability Institute this evening to put on this forum. But before we begin with our speakers, if you've been to a previous Project Impact Forum, you'll know, as I said, that they're very interactive. We encourage you to have your phones out and tweet us questions, as well as take part in an interactive poll, which we're going to be introducing in just a second. So if you could please join me in welcoming Alicia Yadav, one of our Project Impact students, to walk you through the poll. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hi, my name is Alicia Yadav. I'm a senior in anthropology, and as Elizabeth mentioned, all of our Project Impact forums are interactive. That means that you'll be participating in a live poll and live tweeting in your questions. You can tweet in your questions for Mr. Urbina to our Twitter account, which is @project_impact. I will be, myself and fellow Project Impact student Angela Mata will be monitoring your tweets and will be live tweeting the event. I now invite Angela to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Angela Mata, and I'm a junior in political science.
Thanks, Angela. Now, most forums would ask you to put your phones away, but not us. Your phone is going to be your live polling device. So I now invite you to take out your phone with me and tweet to enter our poll. To do this, you'll be tweeting in impact@Purdue to 37607. The instructions are up on the screen, as well as our first polling question. So with each question, you'll be tweeting in the corresponding number to your answer. For example, with this first question, I will be tweeting in PU03 because I'm an anthropology student. Just a reminder, you'll be texting in impact@Purdue to the number 37607. All right, I see we have 83 results coming in. So why don't we move on to the next question? Oh, I'm being told we need a little more time. Okay, great. So we have a liberal arts and humanities heavy audience, but several strong showings from other disciplines as well, which is always great to see. Great. So our next question, we'll be asking about one of the main topics today. So it's, are you familiar with the drilling method hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking? So if you are familiar with fracking, you'll be texting in PU06 to that same number. At the top, again, is 37607. Great. Our next question, more on this topic, is what does hydraulic fracturing recover from the ground? The first, oil and natural gas, coal, uranium, helium, or biofuel. For those just joining us, we're participating in a live poll in which you'll be using your phones to text in responses to these poll questions. As a reminder to everyone, the number that you'll be texting in is at the top of the screen. It is 37607. Looks like our audience did their homework. So, our next question. Do you favor the use of hydraulic fracturing or fracking? Definitely. It should be an option. Not sure, I need more information. We probably should not be using fracking, or definitely not. Great. Next question. What do you think is the smartest source of energy for America? The first option, biofuels. Second, coal. Third, conservation. Fourth, natural gas. Fifth, nuclear. Or sixth, renewables such as solar, wind, geothermal. Very interesting. Next question. What is the most important contribution of fracking? Jobs creation, cheap energy, cleaner energy, energy independence, all of the above, or none of the above? And finally, who do you think should oversee and ensure the safety of fracking? The EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, states, the energy industry, the news media, or other non-governmental watchdogs, other, or there should be no regulation. Great, thank you for participating in our live poll. They'll be invaluable for our guest and for Dr. Raymond to know a little bit more about the audience. It is now my pleasure to introduce Project Impact's director and founder, Ambassador Carolyn Curiel. Ambassador Curiel is a Purdue alumna whose decorated career includes working with Ted Koppel's Nightline, The Washington Post, the New York Times editorial board, as well as serving as a senior White House aide and speechwriter to President Bill Clinton and ambassador to police. She is currently a professor of communication in the Brian Lamb School of Communication. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Curiel.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Alicia. That was a really good job on the poll. Let's give her a hand. It's my real pleasure to work with these students as part of Project Impact. PI, as we tend to call it, gives our students experience in creating quality forums like this. And they do it as they learn about the issues from the top experts that we invite to join us. Not incidentally, it also helps our students to form contacts and networks that have produced opportunities for them after graduation. They have earned it. The students work hard to plan, produce, and market these events. Please join me in thanking all of them. And Miriam, are you here? Okay. So you were told about tweeting in questions. We also have a mic here at the front. The moderator for our evening will invite you during the forum to come up and ask questions that way, but you can also ask by way of Miriam. Introduce yourself, please. Oop, is your mic on?
Hi. I'm Miriam. I'm a senior in political science and PR, and I'm from Bahrain. It's a pleasure to be here.
Miriam Karimi. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Miriam will be stationed at the back throughout. If you are hesitant or don't want to come up to the mic, she will have that roving microphone, and you can ask that way as well. So tonight, a special treat for us all, a discussion on the vital topic of energy, something Purdue knows. Our guest is a senior investigative reporter from the New York Times who has won many awards for his reporting, including the Pulitzer Prize, the highest honor in journalism. His series on fracking produced much conversation, and on Capitol Hill, It spurred a strong reaction and action. Please welcome Ian Urbina. And interviewing Ian, one of our finest researchers on energy policy, the director of the Center on the Environment at Discovery Park at Purdue, and a popular professor of political science, Dr. Lee Raymond. Dr. Raymond, over to you.
This is so comfortable. Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I thought we'd start tonight because I think there's a very wide range, I would imagine, of understanding in the audience about, I actually missed that first part of the poll. I wasn't paying attention like a bad student, I'm sorry. But about what fracking really is. So I thought maybe, Ian, if you could start by just saying a little bit about what in fact is this technology, right? And what are we really talking about tonight?
So fracking is what's called a well stimulation technology, and it's a method for getting the resources, maybe it's oil, maybe it's natural gas, flowing from underground to above ground. And the innovation of it is really a combination of two technologies. It was the fracking itself. So it involves sending a drill bit essentially down underground and using water mixed with chemicals at very high pressure to break up rock, and the resource, oil or gas, comes flowing up. The other technology that allowed for this current drilling boom was the ability not just to drill straight down, but to turn the drill bit horizontal. And that allowed us to access thin layers of rock that previously we would have just gone straight through. And now the drill bit could actually enter these shale layers and break them up and tap into the bubbles of resources that were there and previously inaccessible.
Great. And again, this shale layer, this is quite deep, right? Below the surface. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So it can be deep, it can be shallow. So for example, the Marcellus Shale gets its name from a place in New York, and the shale layer actually comes all the way up to the surface there. But typically it's a mile or so underground, and so the accessing of it is even more difficult because of that depth.
Right, great. So I'll say that if you haven't looked at Ian's articles in the New York Times, you should. It's a really very impressive example of the kind of journalism that the country could use a lot more of. Free editorial comment there. Long-form investigative journalism, and just remarkably well documented. Again, whatever your opinions are on this issue, right, there's a tremendous amount of research that went into the information that we'll be talking about today, and that really went into those stories, and they had a very big impact. So I thought before we got into some of those specifics, if you could just say a couple words about the kinds of information that you really used, right, to generate this series of articles, and the process of obtaining that information, because it was really quite extensive.
So one of the ambitions of the series was to not just publish two-dimensional stories, but rather what we were calling three-dimensional platforms. And by that we meant, in addition to the story, we would have these very rich document readers that would go along with the story and would allow for readers who wanted to know more or wanted to see the evidence behind some of the things we were saying. They could launch into these document readers, which were sometimes 1,000 pages long, and read as many of the documents as possible as we were able to publish. And they would range from internal email exchanges to company surveys and reports to government studies. So the range of documents were from leases, raw leases, to emails, and with each story there was an individual document reader.
Okay. And then you were also on the ground talking to people as well, right, in these communities in Pennsylvania and other affected areas, right? That was another part of what you were really doing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And the standard sort of reporting process, so invariably the stories would require us to go to a specific location where that broader concept was playing out, and get a human sense of it.
Yeah. So based on all of this work, right, and this series of articles that you've published, can you just give us an overview of why this is a controversial issue? Again, opinions in this room probably vary quite dramatically about people, what they think about the issue, but what are some of the big controversies that you really found when you were looking into this?
So on the meta level, what's at stake here is the energy future of the country. And within that is our big questions about who makes decisions about the use of your land, whether and where we're going to get new jobs, what sort of oversight is best for both fostering industry on the one hand while policing against the risks on the other, and how to strike that balance. These are some of the sort of biggest philosophical debates. Within that, there were specific topical areas that show this debate playing out in various ways. So there, were stories that were, in the traditional sense, purely environmental stories, and those typically pivoted on the one hand, there's a desire for jobs. There's a desire for especially low-income communities that are looking for sources of revenue to be able to lease their land to drilling companies. While on the other hand, there was concern about whether this drilling might contaminate the water subsurface or above surface contaminate water or air. Categorically, there were other stories where the controversy also played out. So there was a story about the geopolitics of this issue and how the race for this energy source was reconfiguring relationships between countries and what role the U.S. was playing in that race. There were stories about the legal document that is a lease. So, millions of Americans have signed these leases in a relationship with oil and gas companies, giving them the right to drill on their land. What do those leases say? What rights are granted? To what extent are they prudent, and whose interests do they protect? Each of these, that's just a couple examples, have the same meta philosophical questions at play, but those are just a couple examples.
Okay. So I want to talk about the water quality issues in a second, but since you mentioned leases, I think this is a really interesting point, and again, something that people might not fully understand about the issue. Most of this drilling is happening on private land, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, because this is mostly happening in places like Pennsylvania at this point and Texas, unlike a lot of our other natural gas and oil drilling, which has frequently in the past taken place on public lands, right? Federal lands, especially in the western United States, right? So this is a very different sort of issue to some extent in that respect. Is that right?
And I think that's correct. And I think that that's somewhat by dint of how the drilling boom has unfolded. It has proceeded at a rapid pace, and therefore these companies have moved to a large degree in front of the regulations and gone directly out into the field to engage with private landowners. Now the bigger questions of, well, what to do about either state public lands or federal public lands are starting to catch up. And these are some of the issues that will probably get decided in the next 4 years.
Okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about leases a little bit later, but I think that's an important point, although there were some of these issues in the West around coal bed methane, and again, we can talk more about that later, but really one of the things that makes this a distinctively controversial issue is because it is now drilling that's happening in parts of the country that are less used to drilling, a lot more private property, right? And so it's a very different set of actors and a different set of communities than you've typically had in the Western U.S.
Right, and so to echo that point, so historically, as you point out, major drilling has tended to occur, Colorado on west, which is, these are bigger properties, more sprawling, and so the footprint of industry tends to be less noticeable because you're talking about real estate that the landowner owns 400 acres as opposed to 4 acres, and therefore the roads that are being laid by the company to get to the well pad and the imprint of the industry is less, it's suffered less by the landowner. Now as the drilling boom that we're currently experiencing heads east, you're getting into much more densely populated places like Pennsylvania. And so the typical plot is 4 acres. And that means that when a drilling company lays a road or they have Krieg lights, floodlights on 24 hours a day, the noise of the drilling, these things are felt much more acutely, not only by the individual landowner who leased, but their neighbors,
right,
in a way that out in Colorado or Texas was less the case, and that's why it's become much more heated. And there's also, the record of there's far less experience among the landowners in the East in interacting with the drilling companies compared to folks in Oklahoma and Texas who've been engaged with these companies for a long time, so they know what a lease looks like.
Well, and just to, important contrast that also came up in the initial polls, I think. So unlike a lot of oil and gas development in the West, which is governed by federal law, right, much of which has been around for almost a century or more, students in my environmental policy classes know all about this, you really have a situation with the fracking where that's really been completely delegated to the states, right? So at this point, there's really almost no federal regulation, right, of what's happening. It's all being done at a state-by-state level. Is that?
That's quite correct.
And those states actually are varying quite a lot, right, in their approaches to this problem, right?
And there's also the resources of a state environmental office compared to that of the federal EPA are night and day.
Right.
And so the ability of a regulatory office in West Virginia or Pennsylvania that is state-based, the number of inspectors they have, for example, compared to the number of wells they're supposed to be inspecting and permitting is a much heavier burden than when the feds are.
So you mentioned water, which is clearly a really central part, I think, of a lot of the controversies around this technique. It uses a lot of water, right?
That's right.
A tremendous amount of water, right?
Right.
So one of the things that you mentioned, and your articles talk about this in quite a bit of detail, including some remarkable things that I did not realize, that there's been a fair amount of controversy about what you do with some of this brine, right, that's being injected into these wells, that is then essentially ejected, I guess would be the word, right, as you're then extracting that gas, right? So some of this stuff stays below the surface, but some of it comes back up, right? So can you say a little bit about what some of the issues are around how to deal with that wastewater and what you found about that and some of the issues that you found?
So just to conceptualize a little bit what this looks like. So in essence, you have a drill bit that goes down and then curves, and it's entering these thin layers of shale. And it's breaking them up by injecting massive amounts, millions of gallons of water mixed with various other ingredients, sand and chemicals. And a percentage, it can be 30%, it can be 60%, of that water comes back up the well. So if you're looking at 3 million gallons being put down, you're looking at maybe 1 million gallons coming up. What comes up is a mixture of what you put down and what was already down there. And that's important because what's down there in some cases is uranium or radium. They're naturally occurring radioactive material known as norm. So it was always known that fracking as a drilling technology produces a lot of waste. And it was also known that this waste has a lot of things we don't know about, meaning the secret sauce that an individual company uses in its fracking formula. We don't know what that consists of, but there also are other things mixed in the wastewater that comes up. For example, radioactivity, because it has mixed with the radioactive rock that's down under the earth. So one of the basic questions that we found, we kept asking experts, folks at the U.S. Geological Survey, professors, the whole gamut, industry folks. We know, everyone says the waste is radioactive, but how much, what type, and what's being done with the wastewater? Very simple questions for which we couldn't get full answers, and so that made us eager to press further. To jump to the end of the story, the first story of the series was an attempt to answer some of that with what we found. And what we had found was that previously, the universe of data that sought to answer what's in the waste, specifically with regard to radioactivity, was a universe of 22 wells worth of data, and it came from New York from years ago. And that was the biggest data set that existed. So we thought, well, let's try to expand that massively, and let's look at information about wastewater from as many wells as we can possibly get information for. And ultimately, we built a 300 well database that provided information that the companies had in Pennsylvania been required to produce. So companies were required to look at their wastewater, break down in general what was in it, and report to state regulators that information. But no one had ever gone around the state and collected those. And literally, they were in dusty regional back offices and rickety filing cabinets just stacked there, were the answers of what's in the waste. And what was in the waste was fairly striking. There was, in particular, uranium was less a concern. Radium levels were very high, sometimes 3,000 times the level of what the safe drinking water number is for radium. So one of the things we found was, number one, these wells are producing massive amounts of waste. Number two, often, not always, the wells have in their wastewater high levels of radium. The wastewater in Pennsylvania, not true other places, but in Pennsylvania at the time, was being sent to sewage treatment plants,
right,
which are built to handle organic waste, what you flush, not industrial waste. And so these plants' ability to pull the radioactivity out of the waste was non-existent. So the water was being sent through these plants and passing out the other side, usually into rivers. And there was very little oversight of that process and very little testing in the rivers to see whether these radium and other nasty ingredients were affecting the rivers and the drinking water sources downstream. So that long sentence is essentially what we found out of the first story. Right. From there, the series began.
So there's a real issue then with what do you do with this wastewater, which again, I've read that some of this can be recycled, right? So re-injected essentially, right? You also describe how some of these brines are actually used as road salts, at least in one state, right? West Virginia, I think. Sort of remarkable, interesting factoid. But really, we're no longer allowed to dispose of these in these wastewater treatment plants at this point. Is that correct?
That is right.
Right. So at this point, what is industry doing with these wastewater from these wells right now?
So it varies, again,
right,
depending on the state. So in a place like Texas, there are a lot of what are called disposal wells, which are old wells that are now empty. They're these huge, sort of think of an elevator shaft underground, that are perfect for storing stuff, in this case, waste. And so these are federally approved injection wells in which you can store waste material. And in Texas, for example, and Oklahoma, the geology of those states allows for a lot of injection wells. So the disposal problems are less acute there. They're also arid environments, so a lot of this wastewater was stored in open pits where it would evaporate. So Texas and Oklahoma, less of a problem. Move east, you hit a place like Pennsylvania, there are only 3 federally approved injection wells. So you've got a much bigger problem.
And this is because of the geology of the area, right? Just a distinctive geology, right? Okay.
Exactly. It does not lend itself to injection wells.
Right.
So that's why industry ended up resorting to public sewage treatment plants. And when the series ran soon thereafter, that was shut down. And what then emerged was much of this was, there was always an increasing proportion of this waste that was being recycled. But still the numbers were low. And even when you recycle, you still can take, 10 million gallons of wastewater and clean and get 8 million gallons of clean water, but you still now have 2 million gallons, and I'm making these proportions up, but 2 million gallons of really concentrated dirty water.
Right.
And you have a sludge that's very toxic. So you still have lingering issues, but to the extent that wastewater is not being recycled in a place like Pennsylvania, it's being shipped to other states like Ohio and being injected into wells there, into disposal wells.
So the other thing that, again, if most people know anything about fracking, again, rightly or wrongly. They know about people setting their faucets on fire, right? That's this very famous and extremely controversial scene in the documentary Gasland, due to this methane that's contaminated their wells. And it's, I think, fair to say that one of the most controversial issues is the degree to which this technique is responsible, right, for the contamination of people's actual drinking water, right, as opposed to this wastewater issue. So can you just say a little bit about what you really found about that issue in particular? Because that really seems like a very extremely contested point, right, where industry really claims there are very few or no documented examples, right, where their techniques have contaminated drinking water, and then environmentalists are arguing, actually, this is happening all the time, right? So what did you find about that?
Yeah, so this is where you get into the interesting semantics of these, highly politicized debates. So there are, with regard to the subject of underwater drinking aquifers, from which we get most of our water fountain, water, there are two types of contamination to consider. Potential contamination to consider. One is when you drill down into that shale layer and you break up the shale and the gas flows in the best of worlds up the pipe and to the surface. Sometimes it doesn't go where you want it to go, and it goes elsewhere through fissures in the rocks that have been created or were pre-existing. And it works its way, it doesn't follow instructions, it follows gravity. So it works its way through other routes. So one type of contamination is when the gas itself goes where it's not supposed to. And sometimes it ends up bubbling up in rivers, other times it ends up entering people's wells, their drinking wells, or into the piping of people's homes. And that's how you get these scenes where people turn on their faucet and they can light the water on fire because the gas is heading up. That's one category of contamination. The other category of contamination is the actual liquids that are involved in this process, be they the brine that's already underneath the ground or the secret formula that's being used in the fracking, the liquids, the actual, those ingredients, the fear is that those ingredients can contaminate the underground aquifer, and that's where we get large amounts of our drinking water, and it's very hard to reverse that contamination if it were to happen. Okay, so first, it's important, I think, to separate those two out. Now, let's take the easier one. The flammable faucet, a very real phenomenon.
Right. But one that is alleged to have been true for decades, right?
Right, we'll get there. We'll get there. Yeah, it is a very real phenomenon. And the semantic point that is a seesaw in the debate over it is one about causation. So on one side, I'm John Smith, a farmer in Pennsylvania. My neighbor started drilling 2 months ago. All of a sudden, I turned on my tap and my water's on fire. And I say, look, I've lived here for 20 years, 40 years. My water's never been like this. You guys started drilling a week later, my water's on fire. So John Smith says, you guys caused my water to be on fire. Okay, now I'm Bob Smith, the cousin who works for the company, yeah. Okay, Bob Jones. And I say, now wait a minute, Mr. Smith, help me with the names here. How do you know for sure that we're the reason that your water is on fire? Have you looked at the gas and actually imprinted it to make sure that the gas that we're drilling across the street is the same gas that's coming out in your faucet? Because if it's not, then you can't really blame us for that. Okay, now let's get in between John and Bob. So what the lawyer for the company is arguing, quite legitimately, is that the gas that they're drilling may not in fact be the very same gas that's coming out of the faucet. Why? Because there's a lot of gas under the ground, some of which is directly or indirectly connected to the gas that they're tapping into. And when you do this very industrial process, a lot happens underground, much of it unpredictable. And sometimes fissures open up that are new. Gas that was over here doesn't move up the pipe. It moves over here and pushes other gas sideways, and it moves up a fissure. A lot of unpredictable things happen. And it's not uncommon that the gas that came out of Mr. Smith's faucet is actually a naturally occurring gas that was under the ground, and it's not the same gas that was being drilled. All right, now back to Farmer Smith. if you live in a house and your water is no longer usable, at the end of the day, you don't care about the physics of whether the gas that's coming out of your faucet is the same gas that you're drilling across the street. In the court of law, the drilling company may win that argument because they're not directly the cause of that. But indirectly, they probably are the cause because in all likelihood, what they did indirectly impacted this gentleman's drinking water, and through causation that we can't necessarily map out in detail, gave rise to the consequence that's causing his property value to fall through the floor, his inability to sell his home, his necessity of buying bottled water at $200 a month.
Right.
And this is a guy that probably doesn't have that money. These are real cases time and again, and they've been very well documented. So,
although again, the causality even of the, well,
yeah,
we gave that in Q&A, but even there, the relationship between the drilling and then this guy having gas in his well is still even contested, right? Even not this issue about it being the same gas.
I mean, look,
there's some geologists who will say, look, this is just not connected, right? That when you're drilling a mile underneath this aquifer, this guy's well that's 400 feet deep, you're not going to have put gas into that well, right? At least I've seen that argument.
Look, there are arguments for everything, and
right.
some of them after having reported, I'll say I find them completely unconvincing.
Okay.
And we FOIA'd a document, and we buried it in the document reader.
Freedom of Information Act.
Excuse me.
FOIA,
Yeah.
right,
So
yeah.
we sought records from the state of Pennsylvania, and we heard that there was a database of all cases of this, and they actually had been chronicling them for years. And we put it up on the web, and there are an amazing number of these cases where drilling started on one day, water began becoming flammable on the next day, and oftentimes the causation was never even considered, but the companies settled with these folks because
right.
the sequencing was too suspicious.
Right.
So on the issue of the separation between person's water well goes probably 400 feet underground, drilling is a mile underground. Okay, so the argument is, wait, there's how many feet of rock in between the aquifer or that guy's well and the drilling? How is it possible that it is geologically not
right.
possible? It is possible, and it's been shown again and again. So that's the gas. Then very quickly on the water.
Very quickly,
okay,
yes.
Very quickly on the water. So the other type of contamination is one that is far less documented and frankly far less free. Yeah, we actually published one very well documented case from EPA archives, but it's less frequent, and that is the fear that the actual chemicals that you use when you drill will, rather than the gas going up these other fissures, these chemicals will find their way up the fissures, or abandoned wells, which act like elevators. And the chemicals themselves will end up in John Smith's water well or the aquifer.
Okay.
And that's scary because these chemicals have carcinogenic
right.
elements in them.
So there's a lot of other impacts that hopefully people will ask about in the Q&A because I don't want to take up too much more time. But again, the series talks a lot about some interesting issues about what landowners do and don't know when they sign these leases, right? Also the impacts on the community in terms of all these drilling pads and things like that, right? And truck traffic and other things and these lights that you described. So again, I'll just mention those, but I won't ask you about them at this point in the interest of time. But very quickly, can you just say, so this is not just happening in the US, right? So this is something that is actually really has a global reach potentially, right? And so you talk a little bit about that in your series. So where are some other places where this issue is starting to arise?
So we focused on South Africa.
Right.
Partially because the location in South Africa, namely the Karoo, which is a very arid desert, one of the driest places on the planet, sprawling, is one place that they were looking to do this. And it's an interesting test case because it's such a water-intensive
right.
process, and yet there's very little water around.
So this issue of water scarcity there is the big limiting factor. Where they're going to get these millions of gallons that you need to do this technique is not clear, right? And people are worried about losing their water in these arid areas, farmers and the like, right?
And to some degree, I think the bigger actual concern there is not where are we going to get the water, because you can build pipelines. And, it's where you're going to dispose of what comes out.
Okay. And
the infrastructure just doesn't exist within a price-efficient distance for that kind of drilling. So that's where I think the real questions are.
Okay. And then the last thing I'll ask before we open it up to the audience is, so one of the things that makes this issue, I think, controversial, there are a lot of things that do, but one in particular is that most environmentalists are fairly enthusiastic about natural gas, right? Certainly most of them compared to coal, especially in terms of its climate impact. Most people who study or are worried about environmental issues would much rather see a new generation of electricity power plants that run on natural gas and not coal. So having done this research, right, what would you say to the person who says, well, okay, so right, there are these important problems with this technique, but that the benefits, right, the environmental benefits of this, as I understand it, potentially tremendous new reserve, right, of natural gas, do they really outweigh these relatively sort of important but not as widespread issues that you've described in great detail? Mm-hmm. How do you respond to that, now that you've really thought about this, right, and looked into this for the last year or so? I
guess I probably would say, for starters, this should not be a binary discussion between coal and gas, which is partially to say there are other options as well, but it's more to say if you actually want to have a discussion about it, you have to get into the details of, okay, move forward, but how? And that's really where I think, intelligent debate occurs. So if we are to move forward with natural gas, and if we are going to assume that natural gas is a step in the right direction with regard to climate change, then what are the assumptions at root in that stance? And one of the key assumptions, which is still a very live wire question, is natural gas burns cleaner than coal, right, without a doubt, but unburned methane, i.e. natural gas, actually is far more destructive, 17 times more destructive to the ozone layer. So one key question is, do we know how much of this natural gas leaks?
During the drilling process?
Well, during the drilling, during the transportation, between the stove or the power plant or whatever and it underground, do we have good data to tell us how much of it is being emitted unburned? And if we're going to assume that it's better than coal, don't we have to first know these fugitive emissions, as they're called, rates? And the data on that is very poor. So that would be the first place I would go. And it's probably the most hot button issue, but probably the most important from a climate change perspective. Right. And then downstream, in terms of how we would proceed with natural gas, there are lots of nuts and bolts questions that I think would come next.
Okay, so I think we should go ahead and open things up to the audience. So again, I guess there's a mic. Oh, we have one in the front, one in the back. Is that how we have it set up? So feel free to rest, right? And then, of course, you can also send your questions to Twitter. But if you have a question, come on up or step on back. Do we have a Twitter question to get started while people are getting themselves organized? Do you want to go ahead and do one of those?
We do.
Great.
This question is from Tim Bowling. He wants to know, since publication of your series, have you been targeted in any way by the energy industry?
Targeted. The safe answer is no. And I think it's actually the honest answer, too. I mean, since the series ended, certainly no. During the series, the industry had a lot to say about it, and we were sort of in constant discussion, the newspaper and the oil and gas industry, about things we were publishing. So they were very active in engaging with the reporting throughout. There's a longer story there, but probably not one that fits in this context.
Does anybody in the audience have a question? Yes, in the back. Great.
Miriam will come to you if you raise your hand.
There's one. Yep. This gentleman right here, right?
Yeah, hi. My question is that how many times can we drill at a particular place? And if like it's 3 or 4 times, then after the drilling is done, the gas is all out, then what about the land, that particular land? Is it feasible for, farmers to do the irrigation on that thing again, or that land is, complete waste after that?
So it's a good question, and the type I love because it's down in the weeds. But the upshot of recent engineering breakthroughs is that previously when you would drop a well, you would drop one well from one well pad. And now you have a single well pad that will have, and this is partially that innovation I talked about where you could turn the drill bit. Now you have single well pads with 5, 10, 12 wells off the one well pad. So if you think of a well pad, you have 40 acres, a well pad maybe takes up, 1 acre with all the, trucks and generators and stuff. And if you imagine one well goes down and goes this direction, another well goes down and goes that direction. Now imagine it in sort of spokes. So that's great in the sense from an environmental perspective and from land use perspective. That means that you're not taking lots of land on the surface to drop 5, 12 wells. You still have huge truck traffic because each one of those wells, you still have a big footprint because each well is going to take its own resources. You're going to have lots of water coming in, lots of waste coming out. So you're not going to have less surface imprint in that way, but in terms of the well pad, it's much better than it used to be 20 years ago. Now think of layers. You have different shale layers. Marcellus is just one, but there are other layers, deeper and shallower. More shallow, I don't know what the word is, and so you can tap one and then come back 10 years later and tap a different one. So depending on where you are and what shale layers are there and what the economics are of the price of gas, in other words, is it price efficient to drop a well that's 1.5 miles down? Well, if the price of gas is 9, you could probably make money on that. If the price of gas is 3, it's probably not a good cost-benefit analysis. But the engineering makes it possible to tap different layers. Now, everyone pulls out. Drilling intensely occurs maybe 6, 9 months, then it's all done. You've got what's called kind of a Christmas tree. It's this little metal thing that kind of collects remnant water and things that flow up, but the imprint after you pull out is very minimal. The variation in you as a landowner and what you find after they've all left depends on terms of your lease and what conditions you put in your lease on how they are to restore the land, the nature of the company you interacted with and what their kind of policy is with regard to how much money they put up to put it back to normal. Things like, is that in your lease, did you allow for above ground waste pits? These can be open face, Olympic swimming pool size, I don't know how else to describe above ground swimming pools with earthen walls, and the wastewater gets dumped in there. If you allowed that and your lease allowed that, oftentimes those are covered up. The top water is taken out, and then they just cover it up with dirt and they put seed on top. And there have been story after story of the problems that come after that because the sludge, which is the worst stuff, is left there. It's covered over. You plant crops, erosion, that waste ends up emerging again. So it really varies. The status of your land varies a lot depending on the terms of your lease and the company you worked with.
Okay, I think there's a question up here, right? Sir?
Yes, I haven't read your articles, but I plan to after hearing you today.
Great.
And there's been a lot of hype in the news about how shale oil and shale gas is going to make the U.S. energy independent in a very short time. On the other hand, I've read some things where the depletion rates on these wells are very high, sometimes 40% per year, which kind of negates that the previous claim. Do you have any thoughts or opinions about that?
It's my favorite question, frankly, because again, it's very much in the weeds, and it's the type of thinking that I don't think was occurring enough a year or 2 years ago. It's longer term thinking. So be it gas or oil, fracking is an amazing thing. We can access rock that previously we couldn't. But the engineering of how this works is there's a surge, a grand burst at the beginning, and then there's a slope downward. Again, oil or gas or liquids, these other things that come out that are very valuable, doesn't matter. The graph looks the same. The wells vary. So there may be one well that has a drop-off rate like that and another well that has a very smooth curve. One of the big problems with the hype that was on the front end of this drilling boom was, and you look at the actual investor calls of these companies where company officials are trying to court Wall Street investors, and the things they say are marvelous. I mean, they're talking about these wells and how much gas they'll produce 50 years from now. There were no wells that had been producing for 50 years from whence they could actually say those things. There's no data. The earliest wells had been drilled in Texas, and they weren't even that old. And so, like you say, the real questions have to do with long-term well performance, and some of them we can answer better now than we could 5 years ago, but we still can't answer very well because it's a young technology. But the other issue is this whole equation, well performance and longevity coupled with the price of gas, and also how much does it cost. So you frack your well, you got lots of gas come out. It looks like this. The well starts petering out 5 years later, 6 years later. At some point, it peters out to a point where either you cap it, because it's not price efficient to keep it online, or you refrack it. You stimulate it again, brings it back up. Not as high, but pretty darn high. Refracking can cost $1 million. So the cost analysis of, well, when are we going to start refracking? How much additional water will that require? What kind of waste will that produce? Will regulators have the capital to actually regulate that stage of production? All these questions are ones that don't get discussed on op-ed pages. But those are the real questions that matter if we're going to embrace this.
Yes, I think that's right. Yep.
Hello there. My name is Anthony Worrell. I'm with the Purdue Energy Forum. You've probably talked to a lot of investors and prospectors, I guess companies, who have a great interest in getting this gas and things like that. But have you seen any kind of momentum in building LNG facilities to export this to other countries like Japan, which uses a lot of natural gas and will increasingly more as they get off of nuclear power, because they don't also have that renewable option as much of the United States does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're quite right. There is a real push for export, and that push is coming from a number of factors. One is the current price right now. Again, 2009, the price of natural gas per BTU, the relevant unit, was $15. Within 15 months, it dropped below 4. So, and the excitement around this boom remained up here, even though the reality was, wow, the economics are getting very tough. One of the reasons for export is to try to salvage the economics of production, because we're now tapping into so much of this stuff, but we don't have the demand here domestically for it to bring the price up. And there's a complicated backstory on why there isn't the demand. It has to do with legislation that was on the Hill that maybe would have mandated cities to put their buses on natural gas, and that bill got killed, and all of a sudden the hope for demand disappeared. But there has been an ongoing push for export, and it's getting stronger and stronger as the price of gas remains low longer and longer, and these companies are out in the cold. And I think that's the way it's going to go, with benefits and costs, for Americans.
So let's, since we're being so technologically advanced, do we have another question from the Twitter feed you want to offer?
Yes, our
Great.
next Twitter question comes from Chad Barker, and he asks, at what point does public safety trump the political influence of the energy industry?
Let me make sure I understand the question. So at what point does public safety trump the political influence of the energy industry? So I don't have an answer that will answer that on the general level. I think on a specific level, it depends. And it's a question where you sort of have to look locally. So you look at New York, and you contrast what's happening in New York, which is taking a very wait and see, slow, let's study sort of stance towards this. Very different experience than, say, Pennsylvania, which said, look, we really have an economy that's hurting. We've got a lot of resource here. Let's embrace it and run with it. And New York is missing out on a lot of economic opportunity because it's taking a wait and see attitude. And companies are saying, look, this is too costly to wait and see, and people are suing us, and it's not worth the effort. The flip side is they're studying it much more carefully. And hopefully that will result in smarter oversight. Now you look at Pennsylvania, and the boom got in front of the regulators. So there was all sorts of drilling and activity occurring that even the regulators didn't know about, much less they couldn't keep up with. Those are two different scenarios where the public influence in relation with policymakers and the industry are different. So there's no big answer, they're localized answers.
Okay, so I think there's a question right back here. So,
hi, I'm Sean Hadley. I actually lived in Northeast Pennsylvania until about 2007. Lived in a small rural community in the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area. And about 2 years after I moved away, this Marcellus shale thing really took off in that particular area. And the only industrial experience they had was with a small Procter & Gamble plant. So the culture of that community drastically changed when these companies came in. It was 3 or 4 different companies that actually started utilizing that area. So through your series, how did you evaluate, across a wide range of different communities, how would you evaluate the cultural change as much as the environmental change that we've discussed?
Mm-hmm. So how did I evaluate?
Or what did he see?
What did I find?
Sort of right.
How I evaluated is I went there and talked to people.
So what did you see?
But what did I see? So on the one hand, the culture changes. Let's talk about the positives. A huge influx of money that trickles out. So the local gas station, the local hotels, booming. The local diner. I mean, just unbelievable. Folks that were struggling before, people were moving away, kids were going off to college, not coming back because there were no jobs there. And now all of a sudden the local diner needs more waitresses and waiters. So you have an immense inflow of investment that translates into jobs, not just drilling jobs, not just truck driving jobs, but diner jobs, hotel jobs, building. All right.
And also helping farmers, right? Crucially.
Farmers too.
Some of whom could really use.
Yeah. So there's the story with farmers is more complicated because farmers will get a. So I want to lease my land. I'm a farmer. I've got some acres. They're just sitting fallow. I say, sure, drill. I get a big bonus check up front. It helps a lot. We're talking $10,000, $50,000, and then I get promise that or. Promise is probably too strong, but the possibility that I'll earn royalties if they tap oil or gas, in this case gas, I'll get a cut of the action. But that's, it's going to take a while for that to, they call it mail order money. The salespeople say, look, you just sit there, you go to your mailbox and there's a check there. But in terms of the bonus check is a big surge, but it's not continual. And the royalties is hit or miss. The jobs, the workers that are coming in to work those wells, that's more sustained as long as the boom is going on. Now the flip side, the culture, as you say, I mean the economics are, on the flip side are road traffic, quality of life, crime. Those are serious economic strains on local communities that they, especially in Pennsylvania, very much underpredicted. Some towns that were just hurting because they hadn't negotiated terms on road upkeep. And these trucks are heavy trucks and they run 24/7 and they wear your roads down. Culturally, though, is a more interesting. You have a huge inflow of people, workers. And for all the rhetoric about jobs, and it's very real, a lot of the drilling jobs, debate over how much, goes to out-of-staters. Why? Because drill hands are coming from states where drilling's been going on. So the most experienced, well-paid folks are coming from Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, where drilling's been going on, and they're shipping these folks in. there's still a lot of jobs, truck driving jobs, these sorts of jobs where you need very little experience, a lot of coal miners, a lot of actually offshore BP type folks who are working on oil rigs now taking jobs. So there are those jobs too, but you have jobs being divided, and you also have an inflow of out-of-towners. And these are, to a large degree, young, rough guys, okay? And a lot of them. Read some great reporting out of North Dakota, our paper, others, about how these towns have changed. They're overwhelmingly male, young, working to the bone, and you've got a different feel in the town. Bar brawls, fights, violence in terms of violence against women, rapes in places where there are never rapes, which is not to broad brushstroke drill hands by any means, but it is to say that you start bringing in folks who are not rooted in the community, the nature of that community changes. And it's shown up in very real ways in Pennsylvania, North Dakota, Louisiana, a lot of places.
Okay, so I think, although we could probably get audience questions for a long time, it's my job, it's my unfortunate job to make sure we stay on some sort of schedule. So let me just conclude the questions with one last from the chair here, which is really, so given on the one hand these important community problems, right, that you've really documented, and on the other hand some of these important, potential at least, environmental advantages, right, of some of this natural gas, which I think is pretty widely recognized, with some caveats.
Sure.
Do you have a sense of a way forward? Is there a way to meet sort of these two conflicting demands in this case? And have you seen any sort of movement since you started doing work on this issue a couple of years ago in terms of regulation that might make you more optimistic about the possibility of at least addressing some of the problems that you document, right, starting back in 2011?
So yes to all the questions.
Okay. Great, we're done. That's a wrap.
I've seen movement, probably more to the credit of others, you know, but just the general discussion has shifted. And so the movement, I think, has occurred in the sense that whereas you previously had this binary debate, jobs, are you pro-jobs or are you pro-environment? That's the fracking debate. Now it's questions like the gentleman asked, you know, these release questions, your geopolitical questions, should we export, should EPA or states, you know, there's a much more sophisticated sense of the 25 internal questions rather than a true or false debate. Okay. So that's one development. I also think that, and this is partially from the series, there has been a more aggressive role taken by the bodies that should be policing this. Mm-hmm. So the SEC opened an investigation, the New York Attorney General opened an investigation, the Maryland Attorney General began investigating, all these on various issues. You know, are companies overstating how profitable these wells are people framing leases in fraudulent ways? All these sorts of questions are now being more aggressively asked by state and federal authorities, and that, I think, is a step in the right direction. Right. What their answer is up to them.
Right. Okay, that's great. So I will make a final just mention that if you have more questions, which many of you might, there is a lot of activity on campus this semester around this issue. There will be an event that is sponsored by the Ecological Sciences and Engineering graduate program in April. It will be an evening workshop featuring a number of different experts who are academics and others who have worked on this issue, so you should keep your eyes open for that event if you'd like to learn more. And then I guess you've got, and then the final poll question. Exactly right, my apologies. So I guess we have a final poll question as well for the audience before we wrap things up, right? Do I read that, or is that? I'm not sure I even have it. So do you mind reading it? Thank you.
Okay, so we have a final poll question for you. So to open up your text messages again and tweet back in, we just want to get a response or just a reaction based off of this great discussion. Has tonight's program changed your view on fracking? Again, you're going to be texting in your answer to the number 37607, and you're going to be texting in your corresponding number to your response. So If you are outright in favor of fracking now, you'll be texting in PU38. If you're somewhat in favor, PU39, and so on.
No running results. I feel like I need the guys on
better.
election night.
That
right?
would influence.
Exactly.
That's right.
Yeah.
No exit polls, just the final results.
Okay, let's see.
Wow, neck and neck.
Yeah.
This has the feel of a beauty contest.
Yeah, something, right? Iowa straw poll. Yeah.
We'll give them 20 more seconds.
Oh, hurt my neck. Pretty even? Okay.
It's very even.
Can we put the poll back up one more time? Thank you. At this time, Project Impact would like to honor Mr. Urbina and Dr. Raymond with gifts being presented by Project Impact students Paul Rosenberger, a senior in electrical engineering from Sheridan, Indiana, and Kyle Walker, a senior in political science from San Diego, California, to serve as a token of our appreciation for their participation in tonight's event. Let's hear it for these gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you. Thanks for organizing this.
My name is Chad Barker, and I'm a junior from Lafayette, Indiana, majoring in political science. And on behalf of Project Impact, I'd like to extend our most sincere thanks for your participation in tonight's dialogue. To conclude our event, we invite you to attend a reception with Mr. Urbina and Dr. Raymond in the adjacent Stewart Galleries. Light refreshments will be served. Also, please join us in 2 weeks on February 26th at 5:30 p.m. for a conversation with noted presidential historian Richard Norton Smith, where we will examine our divided democracy and how presidents have worked with and around Congress. Our ushers are handing out cards for your convenience as you exit. Thank you again for your participation in this important dialogue, and have a great evening.
And here you can
Well done. That's all right.
check out today's paper. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Would Project Impact students who participated in this event please come forward for a picture?
And as I expected, I had so many more things I wanted to ask you.
Some questions like
yes.